All right, so hello. This is our podcast on kind of the Eastern European region. My name is Kai Miller, and my focus was on Russia.
My name is Nikolai. My focus was on Kazakhstan.
My name is Tristan, and my focus was on the Czech Republic.
So I guess the first thing we kind of want to talk about is being in the region where we're in. We kind of have a lot of post-Soviet era influence, and so we kind of want to talk about that first. Um, Kind of the main importance of that is Russia kind of being the main remnants of that post-Soviet era, and the influence it had. In the other countries we have, talking about Kazakhstan, used to be part of the Soviet era, and we can see some influence from there. Um, but we also have some other states that we'll talk about later, like the state of Ukraine and that war, which has some post-Soviet era ties. Um, but that's kind of the first thing I wanted to talk about.
So to kick it off in Kazakhstan, the effect of the post-Soviet era is quite interesting to see considering their religious composition right now. So within the Soviet era, it being very a-religious, a lot of both the original religion in the Kazakhstan and the Muslim influence that came through there was very heavily suppressed. So, to give a little bit of context on that, the native religion in Kazakhstan is Tengrism, uh, which is a very, oh Lord, it's a very ambiguous religion. They do not have a defined God. It's more tied into the state of nature. And then throughout the centuries, as the Islamic conquests began, a lot of the Kazakh steppe was actually sacralized for the Islam monuments, and there are many pilgrimages that happen through that land, which really established Islam as a religious majority in there. And post Soviet era, much of that fell apart, where Islam is still a key player, but some sources indicate that as Kazakhstan shifted away from that Russian mentality, they started seeking back their own religion. And what that came down to was simply tracing genetic lineage to see who had more Kazakh blood in them, which then turned into a Zhuzh system, which I think is pretty interesting.
Then I guess talking about Russia a little bit more, it's important to note that during Soviet control of these kind of states around Eastern Europe, being a communist socialist kind of area, these religions were very heavily suppressed during that time. And upon the downfall of the Soviet Union, we saw a lot of these religions kind of come back, like especially in Russia, like totally anti-religious. All of your energy was going to the state for production, things like that. But then once the Soviet Union fell, we saw a big revival of Christianity and specifically Orthodox Christianity, mainly with um, the eastern portion of Russia. Like the border near Kazakhstan has some Islamic influence, just because of how big the country of Russia is. So there's going to be a big mix of religion, but the main area that we want to focus on for Russia in terms of religiosity is the eastern portion, which is about like 90% Eastern Orthodox. So it's pretty interesting to see that kind of big swing to the other side from basically completely atheist during the Soviet Union and then post-Soviet era going almost like completely Christian nation.
And I looked into the Czech Republic, which is in contrast to pretty much all of Europe, especially Eastern Europe and Western Asia, it is 70% religiously unaffiliated, and the next biggest block religiously is Catholics at 26.4%, which is interesting as it is a major outlier in the region. This is kind of a holdover from when they were Soviet occupied and shortly after 1948. And unlike a lot of former Soviet states, they seem to have remained religiously unaffiliated.
So then moving on a little bit, we kind of want to also touch on the current events that are happening in the region, mainly being the Russian-Ukrainian war, as well as the implications that holds. We found a couple interesting things regarding a whole bunch of things with why Russia's invading Ukraine, the implications that could have for other countries around our region, such as Kazakhstan or the Czech Republic, as well as why this may be a retaliatory push from Russia towards the Western powers. So the first thing I kind of want to point out is that it seems mainly this is a retaliatory push against the West, since the two don't really have the greatest alliance and friendships. We saw a kind of push from Ukraine to move towards a more Western kind of democracy, liberal ideas that Russia really didn't like and kind of felt threatened by. We also saw that with the addition of Finland to NATO. Finland historically has kind of been a buffer between the West and the East, kind of as like a neutral party. But with Finland kind of going to NATO and with Ukraine kind of feeling a more Western pull with their ideas, Russia kind of feels almost like they're back into a wall towards Western ideals that they don't really want to take a hold of.
In this respect, Kazakhstan is not that major of a player in that conflict, but they're definitely very much affected. In an interview between Putin and the Kazakhstani leadership, was revealed that Kazakhstan is very much economically dependent on Russia, with numbers like 10 billion of economic support going to Kazakhstan. And as they said, 17,000 enterprises in Kazakhstan are Russian founded. And another very big relationship between the two is the import and export of oil and gas. In Russia, one of the big political monopolies is Gazprom, a gas company. And many of the resources between Kazakhstan and Russia are being swapped, also in part to the fact that they are part of the CIS. And so they hold a very economic and defense relationship between the two countries.
Yeah, it seems a lot like a bunch of Eastern countries like Russia, North Korea, China. It seems that a lot of them feel threatened by continued collaboration between Western countries, continued organization, further membership joining into NATO, and there seems to be a desire and effort towards creating similar alliances in the East that are free of Western influence.
But in addition to this, we also found that Russia might be invading Ukraine for some other reasons, such as a religious foundation, which we think is kind of concerning for all countries in the region, because these smaller states such as Kazakhstan and maybe some of the former Soviet states that Russia may want to reclaim, such as the Czech Republic as well, which not a Soviet state, did have Soviet influence, as Tristan will get onto a little bit later. But we found that because of the religiosity of Putin being a Orthodox Christian, that means that religion and government are almost intertwined. And in that sense, Putin sees himself as a almost like super moral being that would need to spread his morality to these other states that maybe he doesn't see as being very moral. Um, and Ukraine being one of them. But we think this has implications for other countries that, were under Soviet control. Like, what if if he takes over Ukraine, what if Putin doesn't stop at Ukraine? What if he keeps going to the countries that Russia once had control over, such as Kazakhstan and the Czech Republic?
So, an interesting parallel I found with that philosophy is how, not really in this decade, but in the early 2000s, how Kazakhstan was being run. And one term that is used there was it was under a soft authoritarian regime. So, in a sense, one might say that the Soviet Union never really left Kazakhstan. And some of the ways that that manifested was manipulation of competitors. Much like in Russia, there's dispute on how legitimate the 2020 election was, with to kind of jump into your territory. But with Navalny being a very strong political opponent to Putin, and with his poisoning and sabotage that happened later, there's very similar things happening in Kazakhstan with, at the time, control of state sponsored media, um, hard coercion of political enemies. Um, and through this not full dictatorship, but still soft authoritarianism, Nazarbayev, as they said, was able to engineer economic growth, avoid ethnic conflict, and manage a complex geopolitical portfolio. But nevertheless, with that background, is very much working with Putin and staying on that CIS side of things, which maybe could be seen if, like you said, Guy, Putin decides to push further, that could be an already set up partnership.
Then I think finally we want to talk a little bit about the economics of kind of Eastern Europe. Um, as has been stated before, Europe has kind of put an embargo on Russia, and Russia is a major exporter of many natural resources that Europe and the surrounding areas, such as Kazakhstan and the Middle East, kind of use for power, such as natural gas and oil. And what that has done has limited those resources to Eastern Europe, such as some of the other countries like we talk about, like the Czech Republic, or some of the other major European powers. And what that's done is created kind of a crash in the European financial market. Because if countries aren't getting power, they don't have enough power to produce. Stuff like that. People lose confidence in the systems and companies over there, um, which I think produces a pretty interesting, almost power dynamic that has to be solved in the region as a whole. Of yes, you should punish Russia for doing a bad thing for invading Ukraine, but you're also suffering a little bit for it.
Yeah, I think ultimately it's the European dependence on Russian oil, which my understanding is Europe has been working pretty hard to get away from that dependence, but they still at least partially have it for the time being. And ultimately, that dependence makes it very hard for them to move away from Russian oil without sabotaging themselves somewhat in the process, which it seems a lot of them have been willing to deal with in order to continue sanctioning Russia.
Yeah, I also think this could potentially push the East and the West further apart than they already are, because if you're gonna stop buying natural resources, then you're kind of furthering those, connection as loose as they might be, you're still severing those connections, which I think further pushes the East away from the West. And I know I saw recently that Kazakhstan has become a partner member of BRICS, not like a
Absolutely, yes.
full for a member, but still a partnership, which is a fairly recent development. But I think it still shows that like you're getting these Eastern European countries that were kind of neutral for a long time of just kind of trying to exist in the world that are now really starting to choose an alliance. And this BRICS kind of coalition that the West really doesn't want to see grow to a power inevitably is growing in power day by day. And so I think kind of forcing Russia to send more resources to an allies inevitably boosts the East economics and strengthening their powers more than the West really wants to.
Yeah, absolutely. With Russia and Kazakhstan being kind of allied states at this point, uh, well, like I said, Kazakhstan isn't taking a part in the war, the conflict, and as such, the negotiations with the West. They're still very much feeling the same repercussions of Russia. With, for example, when the war started, when there was replacing of all the imports, like McDonald's, Burger King, all had to leave Russia and were very soon replaced by Russian state-owned places. It is a very similar story in Kazakhstan, and while they are not actively in the conflict, sorry, they're feeling those same repercussions, which, in my opinion, is definitely a polarizing factor in this division between East and West.
So, if I'm understanding right, you're saying that like Western businesses are leaving Kazakhstan as well as a result of Russia's actions?
Yes and no. They were there in less of an extent, but with the whole business partnership with Russia, many of those replacements are also in Kazakhstan to a greater degree.
Interesting. I've never heard of that before.
Well, I think we're almost out of time, so any other lingering comments?
Think I'm good?
Good to go.
Well, I hope whoever's listening learned a couple things about the region, and we're happy to share it with you. Thank you.